All right. Greetings and thank you for joining today's training webinar titled Wake Up Before You Go Go, Practical Solutions to Reduce Drowsy Driving. On behalf of the Governor's Highway Safety Representative for the state of Louisiana and Executive Director of the Louisiana Highway Safety Commission, Ms. Lisa Freeman, I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. As a longtime public safety advocate and current board member of the National Governor Highway Safety Association, Lisa has been championing efforts to prevent risky driving behaviors for many years. This webinar, which is LHSC's first one focused on drowsy driving in collaboration with the National Sleep Foundation, is something she's been wanting to do for a long time. My name is Christy Miller, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's session. We are recording today's session for future reference. Within a week, LHSC, my agency, will disseminate the recording link and a PDF of the presentation slides to all individuals who registered for the webinar. But before we get started with our amazing content, if you'll indulge me, I'll just address a few housekeeping issues. Today's session is being hosted on Zoom, and there are a few features I want to go ahead and make sure that you're aware of. This session, as you entered, automatically muted all participants as you joined. If you look in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you can see that your audio and your video icons have red lines through them, which means that you are muted. If you want to turn on your video, you're welcome to do so, but we are asking all participants to remain muted for the entirety of the webinar to minimize disruption of our presenters. We do want you to actively engage with the session participants and even the panelists, however, and you can do that in several ways. First, you're invited to use the chat feature. As a matter of fact, please click on chat now. So that'll be on your toolbar, and it'll open the chat window where you can submit your name and your affiliated organization. We hope everyone, all of our participants, will do so now. So open your chat and type in your name and your affiliated organization. As you continue to do this, please consider this chat as a place to network and to interact with other participants. You're welcome to offer suggestions or maybe even additional examples of solutions as our panelists talk about their research, their experience, and their strategies for addressing drowsy driving. However, we will ask that you do not pose questions to the panelists in the chat window, because we hope there'll be so much networking going on among you all. Instead, you may notice on the toolbar that there is a Q&A, a question and answer spot. We're asking you to please pose any questions to your panelists using the Q&A button. This will help ensure all questions are viewed and that they will be receiving responses at the end of the webinar. We've allocated time at the end for Q&A, so we do encourage you to ask questions. If possible, please note if your question is for a specific panelist. And if not, we'll see if all panelists want to respond as time permits. The next feature we have is the react button. So we're hoping that you will take opportunity to react by expressing interest or appreciation. If you click the react button, you'll see a thumbs up, you'll see smiley faces, you'll see confused faces. Please feel free to use those along the way to express interest, appreciation, or maybe concern or questions about content offered. And finally, you should see some closed captioning happening along the bottom of your screen. That is for those of you who may be hard of hearing or are not, or in shared office spaces or not in your own office space and want to keep your volume low. If it's distracting to you, however, you can turn it off by clicking Hide Closed Captioning. Ladies and gentlemen, you're in for a treat for today's webinar. For those of you who aren't aware, last week, which was November 2nd through the 8th, was Drowsy Driving Prevention Week. DDPW is a national campaign that was created 18 years ago by the National Sleep Foundation. During last week, NSF, the National Sleep Foundation, LHSC, my organization, and many, many other public health and safety advocates across the country called on citizens to prioritize sleep and drive only when alert and refreshed. But we know drowsy driving isn't behavior that happens only 1 week out of the year. It happens every day. So we had no qualms about having LHSC and NSF keep the campaign going by delivering this webinar the day after the ending the week of DTBW. LHSC is particularly grateful to the National Sleep Foundation. These three panelists had a ton of activities, particularly a major traffic safety expert panel that they participated in last Thursday live in DC at the National Press Club. So thank you all for digging deep and being willing to share your expertise with our stakeholders here in Louisiana for today. Each of today's panelists are major players at the National Sleep Foundation. There's Dr. Joe Jarshevsky. He is the Senior Vice President of Research and Scientific Affairs at NSF. Joe oversees the development of NSF's sleep health guidelines and the sleep health research activities. He also serves as an NSF sleep expert for media and industry partnerships. Dr. Jarshevsky's educational background is in clinical health psychology. He believes in the importance of translating science to the public, healthcare professionals, and policymakers to engender positive change in the world. The second panelist you'll hear from today is Dr. Mark Rosekind. He's a dynamic and visionary safety, sleep, and policy leader with more than 35 years of experience enacting strategic, practical, and effective data-based solutions that enhance safety and health in complex environments. From 2014 to 2017, Dr. Rosekind served as the 15th administrator of NHTSA, that's the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, an appointment that was made by President Barack Obama. Other relevant experience of Dr. Rosekind's include serving as the director of the Center for Human Sleep Research at Stanford University's Sleep Disorders and Research Center, directing the Fatigue Countermeasure Program at the NASA Ames Research Center, and founding Alertness Solutions, a scientific consulting firm that specialized in fatigue management. Currently, Dr. Rosekind serves as a member of the NSF Board of Directors. Last, ladies and gentlemen, but certainly not least, our panel will be rounded out by Mr. John Lopost. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Sleep Foundation. John has an extensive and diverse experiences across multiple commercial healthcare and nonprofit organizations. He has longstanding ties to the sleep health community, including his connection to NSF for 20 years, including 8 years as a member of its board of directors. For the past decade, Mr. Lopos has led NSF's advocacy efforts on Capitol Hill regarding various policy initiatives that include sleep health equity. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to continue to, if you haven't yet, put your name and your affiliated organization in the chat. Definitely be sure to use the Q&A to ask questions of our panelists. Before I turn it over to this brain trust, because we know we would not pull together this amount of folks just to hear me talk, but I'd like to give you all just a little foundation about drowsy driving. I think many people tend to think they know what it is, but let's get clear about what we really are talking about today in terms of risky driving behavior. So definitely we acknowledge drowsy driving can be caused by factors such as sedating medications and substance use, medical conditions and illnesses, and engagement in just repetitive motion that gets you very drowsy. But for the purposes of this training, the predominant cause of drowsy driving is when a person drives while being impaired due to an inefficient amount of quality sleep. And we're definitely going to hear a lot about the science of sleep and sleep health. that quality sleep that's necessarily for safely operating a motor vehicle. Drowsy driving is impaired driving, according to the National Sleep Foundation and many of our sleep health experts. As such, drowsy driving is often called the fourth D among drunk, drugged, and distracted causes of impaired driving. While each may have their distinct features, all of these conditions slow reaction times and affect alertness and decision-making to increase the risk of motor vehicle crashes. Believe it or not, drowsy driving is a significant risk to public health and safety, and it's associated with potentially catastrophic personal and societal consequences, including the preventable loss of life and extensive economic damages. Motor vehicle crashes, or MVCs, caused by drowsy driving can account for roughly 20% of all motor vehicle crashes, according to NHTSA. Meanwhile, data from the AAA Foundation for Safety implicate sleepiness in 21% of all MVCs, resulting in deaths, and an additional 13% of MVCs, resulting in hospitalizations. This can total more than 300,000 police-reported crashes, 100,000 injuries, and 6,400 deaths in the U.S. each year. So to complement the best data available from federal transportation safety sources, the National Sleep Foundation collects its own data through representative population level surveys about Americans' attitudes and behaviors about drowsy driving and their sleep health. The results of NSF's surveys highlight that over 60% of U.S. adults and almost 70% of U.S. parents have driven drowsy. This reveals concerning evidence of the broad public mindset that minimizes the risk and consequences of drowsy driving compared to other forms of impaired driving. Research published in 2018 concluded that sleeping only 4 to 5 hours in a 24-hour period increases a driver's crash risk as much as a blood alcohol concentration, or BAC, of 0.05. And getting less than 4 hours of sleep increases crash risk as much as a BAC of roughly 0.12. That would be 1.5 times the national legal limit. So what causes drowsy driving? Obviously, being too tired or too fatigued is what causes drowsy driving. But what are the risk factors for fatigue? That question is much more complex. Risk factors for drowsy driving mainly fall into sort of 3 major buckets. That's sleep deprivation, a time on task, a repeated time on task, and the time of day. Other risk factors include physical and/or mental exertion, consuming alcohol, certain foods and/or medications, extreme temperature, undiagnosed or untreated sleep disorders, such as obstructive sleep apnea, insomnia, or narcolepsy. Or, of course, there could be a combination of some of these risk factors that exacerbate one or more cause. Now that we have a good understanding of what causes drowsy driving, let's discuss the warning signs. So our panelists today are going to share many of the solutions or ways to further identify drowsy driving. But some warning signs for you as a driver, for folks that you're riding in a vehicle with, and for those of you who happen to be in commercial or business industry, for your drivers, here are some of the major warning signs. You know, I admit to driving on autopilot from one location to another whenever, particularly if I'm coming to or from work. And, you know, sometimes I say, oh, I don't even really remember getting there. So it's quite easy to have that experience. It's also quite easy for those of you who live here in Baton Rouge or drive in Baton Rouge often to feel aggravated while sitting in traffic. And so definitely these warning signs need to be taken into consideration about just whether your mind is distracted or you're frustrated because it is behavior that you've always done, or whether it is because you're too tired or too fatigued to drive. So again, some of these warning signs, you may start to experience disconnectedness and brain fog. Chances are you're driving drowsy. If you're yawning too much, if you're missing exits or asking yourself, was that light red or was it actually green that I just went through? Chances are you may be driving drowsy. So drivers experiencing these warning signs, at a minimum should pull over to a safe place and only continue to drive once they're alert and refreshed. So the different effects of drowsy driving on yourself include behaviors like decreased vigilance, a loss of alertness or concentration. As I said, questioning whether you saw a traffic sign or whether you just yielded at a certain traffic light. But lack of memory and slowed reaction time, impaired judgment and impulse control, they're all scary enough on their own, but the effects of these behaviors can go way beyond, because the behavior of one driver can have ripple effects on multiple drivers. Remember that as a drowsy driver, you're operating a vehicle that weighs between 1.5 and 40 tons, depending upon the type of vehicle you're driving. So the impact on you, on your passengers, on other motorists is potentially enormous. Drowsy driving can and does contribute to motor vehicle crashes that result in fatalities, injuries, property damage, and a loss of productivity. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that brief introduction to drowsy driving, I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Joseph Sharshevsky, who's going to talk to us about the science of sleep and the importance of sleep health. Joe, turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and for all that great background information too. I'm reminded right now, I have young children, and they're into the animated movie Aladdin. At one point, Aladdin meets the genie, who's feeling kind of down, and Aladdin asks him what the problem is. And I'm not giving a direct quote, but the genie says something like, "I have all this power and very little living space, and right now I feel like I have all this content and very little time." And I'm sure I'm speaking from other panelists here the same way. Big topics, important topics, and we have a very tight schedule. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and move on. You could to the next slide. To level set, I wanted to give a brief introduction to NSF because I'm the first presenter for National Sleep Foundation. National Sleep Foundation is an independent nonprofit organization dedicated to improving health and well-being through sleep education and advocacy. It's the mission of the organization, and we've been working collectively towards this mission for 35 years now. NSF also has a promise to the public to help anyone and everyone be their best slept self. Now, with both the mission and the promise in mind, National Sleep Foundation really views sleep health as public health, and we use that as our guiding North Star. So much so that the organization even published a textbook on sleep health for public health professionals, as you can see over there pictured. Everything we do is really with this in mind. So since the founding of the organization 35 years ago, National Sleep Foundation has been working to help curb the drowsy driving problem, and for 18 years now, been hosting Drowsy Driving Prevention Week. And just an incredibly important public health topic for all of us to pay attention to, more attention actually needed. If we could go on to the next slide, I'm going to give the briefest of overviews of the basics of sleep. And I really must emphasize this. I think there's going to be 3 or 4 slides coming up. These are whole courses on this topic, but we'll get it in 3 slides. So next slide. When we think about sleep, if you could to the next slide, and we think about what's really driving our sleep, there are 2 big factors here. We all have our internal circadian rhythm controlled by our biological clock. It's an internal, mechanism housed in the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, but all of our bodily functions, our physiological functions, even our social functions are really driven by natural rhythms that happen. Our body temperatures fluctuate throughout the day up and down naturally, and so do our levels of alertness and sleepiness. We're more alert at certain times in the day. A great example is, 3 o'clock after lunch, we're feeling this little bit of a dip in alertness. That's a natural circadian phenomenon. So your circadian rhythm regulates how alert you feel and how sleepy you feel at different times of the day. But there's also this homeostatic pressure, this sleep drive. It's a biological imperative that we sleep, just like eating, just like breathing. The homeostatic sleep drive essentially just says that the longer that someone's been awake, the more pressure, the more drive they have to sleep. Similar to hunger, right? The longer it's been since you've eaten something, the hungrier you feel, the more drive you have to hunger. And you can actually test this out yourself right now because we have this similar biological drive to breathe. If you take a big breath right now and hold your breath as I talk, maybe right now you don't feel this big urge to breathe, but if I continue on, you're going to feel the urge. You're going to feel this building. That's your homeostatic drive to breathe. Same thing happens with sleep. The longer you've been awake, the more your drive. Once you fall asleep, your drive to sleep kind of dwindles. These two things work in harmony when people are sleeping well. You build up this drive to sleep right when your body says, "Hey, sleep should be happening now." You sleep throughout the night, you wake up, there's a bit of an alerting signal, and you repeat it throughout the day. Sleep is one of these things that happens great when you set the stage and you just let it happen. Next slide. Now, when you're actually sleeping, a lot of fascinating things occur. We used to think it was this state when you were just unconscious and there was a relative lack of activity, but there's so much happening throughout the night that's fundamental and core to our daytime performance and safety. Sleep could be broken into two big stages: non-REM sleep, which includes stages one, two, and three, and then REM sleep. These stages one, two, and three are all slightly different. Stage one is your lightest stage of sleep. This is the sort of stage where if we hook you up to some EEGs and I know that you're sleeping, if I poke you and say, "Hey, what you doing?" You'll say, "Oh, just resting." You won't even acknowledge that you're sleeping most of the time. Stage two is a little bit deeper sleep. I'd have to poke you a little bit harder, say your name a little bit louder, and you might recognize, acknowledge that you were sleeping. Stage three sleep is entirely different. It's slow wave sleep, your deep sleep. Some people call it the most restorative segment of sleep. Then you talk about REM sleep. This is where most dreaming occurs. Not all of it, but most of it. You do a lot of memory and emotional processing during this phase of sleep. Something I like to always tell people is that all of these components of sleep are important. You'll hear a lot of stuff in the media about trying to hack your slow wave sleep or your REM sleep or strategically increase one or the other. They're all important. That's why we have them all, and they all work together. If you could go to the next slide, please. Throughout the night, you fluctuate and you shift between these various stages. So if you look all the way to the left, you see that the person's awake, then maybe around 10:20 or something, they fall asleep and they go into light sleep and they spend a little bit of time there, a little bit of time into a little bit deeper sleep. Then down in green, they're in that slow wave sleep, and then they bump all the way back up, and then they spend a little bit of time in REM sleep. That whole thing that I just described is one sleep cycle, somewhere around 90 minutes, and you cycle throughout these phases in pretty predictable fashion throughout the night. Couple things to keep in mind when you look at this. The green, which is your slow wave sleep, your deep sleep, is more consolidated in the first half of the night. Your red, your REM sleep is more consolidated. There's more of that in the second half of the night. Sometimes you'll have people say, "Oh, I sleep so good at the beginning of the night, and then it's a little more broken up at the end of the night." It's supposed to be like that. Sleep again is very predictable in this sense because it's biologically driven. You'll see that there are a couple wake ups here. All of that is perfectly normal. This is a good night of sleep for an individual, what you see on the screen. But we go through these phases throughout the night. Now, if you go to the next slide, and we can skip right over, I'll be talking about what actually constitutes sleep health. So we know what sleep is, but what's good, healthy sleep? National Sleep Foundation defines sleep health as this multidimensional conceptualization of sleep that includes things like the quantity, the quality, and the impact of sleep, among a whole host of other things. That was defined in 2017. Today, our conceptualization is presented here on the screen, where we see multiple factors that we consider are part of good, healthy sleep. How long you've slept. Most adults need 7 to 9, older adults a little bit less, 7 to 8, teens 8 to 10 hours of sleep per night. but you want that sleep to be of good quality. NSF defines good quality sleep as sleep in which it doesn't take you a long time to fall asleep. You're not waking up over and over again for extended periods throughout the night. And most of the time that you're in bed, you're actually sleeping. You want to wake up feeling satisfied with your sleep and be able to stay awake all throughout the day. That's sleep satisfaction. You want to maintain consistent and regular bed and wake times. There's a abundance or a growing bit of literature now that shows that even the regularity of your sleep schedule is on par with how important duration is for a lot of outcomes. Sleep disorders are an important consideration. People with undiagnosed, untreated, or undertreated sleep disorders are obviously not going to have the healthiest of sleep. You want to practice good, healthy sleep behaviors throughout the day and in the evening to promote good sleep health. And how you're functioning throughout the day really depends on how well you're sleeping. So we actually include that in this conceptualization of sleep health in terms of your health, your well-being, your safety, and your performance. Taken as a whole, this is what good, healthy sleep like looks like. But I'll share some population statistics now about sleep health in the US. So if we could go to the next slide. What you can see on the left is National Sleep Foundation's sleep duration recommendations across the lifespan, right? Newborns and young children need more sleep than adults. But what you see are current estimates of sleep duration. So we see that 8 in 10 teens don't regularly get enough sleep. That's in the general population. These are new drivers, so you could think about how that might, come to play. And then nearly two-thirds of adults aren't regularly or consistently getting enough sleep. So we have a problem with not getting enough sleep. Next slide. In terms of our sleep quality, you'll see the sleep quality checklist. Like I said, it's about how long it takes for you to fall asleep, how many times you wake up, for how long, these sorts of things. But you can see, again, population parameters collected by National Sleep Foundation. More than two-thirds of us have a hard time falling asleep. Half of us wake up often throughout the night, with a third of those then having difficulty going back to sleep. And more than 1 in 3 adults don't have good, efficient sleep. They're awake for too long in the bed. So we have a situation where most of us aren't getting enough sleep and we have poor quality sleep. So on the next slide, this should not be surprising that a lot of us aren't satisfied with our sleep. If we're not getting enough sleep and we're getting poor quality sleep, we're largely going to be unsatisfied with the sleep we get. More than 1 in 3 teens gets an F for their sleep satisfaction on National Sleep Foundation sleep satisfaction tool, and more than 50% of adults gets an F. So a failing grade for our overall sleep satisfaction. Not a good situation to be in. If you could click to the next slide, please. Sleep disorders is a really important topic, especially as it relates to drowsy driving. Couple things to clear up. Not having a sleep disorder does not mean that you have good sleep health. You can still have very poor sleep health and not have a sleep condition, a sleep disorder. And having a sleep disorder does not mean that you have poor sleep health. If you have a appropriately diagnosed and well-managed sleep condition, you're at no more risk for drowsy driving and you can have perfectly fine sleep health. Now, having said that, that's all very true, but I can also say with pretty good confidence that most people with sleep disorders get a little bit less sleep, have poor quality sleep, are unsatisfied with their sleep, have irregular sleep, and experience a lot of daytime consequences. I'll draw highlights to two of the main sleep conditions, most prevalent sleep conditions, that being insomnia and sleep apnea. Both are associated with drowsy driving. And I'll go a little bit deeper into sleep apnea. There are some good research studies out there that show that people with untreated sleep apnea are at multiple times risk of driving while drowsy. Now, the good news is that when sleep apnea is appropriately treated, in some of these cases with PAP therapy, their rates of drowsy driving actually reduce back down to population levels. So again, appropriately treated sleep disorders is an important step for road safety. Next slide, please. When we think about healthy sleep behaviors, National Sleep Foundation promotes 3 simple daytime behaviors and 3 simple evening behaviors that can help everyone be their best slept self. During the day, we encourage everyone to get good exposure to bright light, especially in the morning, to get regular physical activity, and to eat their meals at consistent times. In the evening, it's important that we avoid the heavy meals, the alcohol, the caffeine, nicotine before bed. We want everyone to have that good, consistent, relaxing wind down routine, allowing for the ever important 7 to 9 hours of sleep, and to maintain a sleep friendly environment. National Sleep Foundation regularly polls and checks in on the American public, and we know that almost a third of teens aren't practicing high levels of these behaviors, and over 40% of adults aren't practicing high levels of these behaviors. So there's lots of opportunity for us to improve our sleep health right here with some of these behaviors. And it's important we do that because if we go to the next slide, we can really see that our sleep is crucial for our functioning from head to toe, from side to side. Really, there's no body system that's immune to the consequences of poor sleep, and there's no body system that doesn't benefit from good, healthy, quality sleep. Important for this conversation is when we look at the text going to the head. You see things like attention problems, reaction time, decision making. Those are critical behaviors to be maintained, and not just maintained, but optimized when we're driving around in these, 1.5 ton vehicles that we just heard about earlier. So next slide, please. And one more, we'll get into drowsy driving, a little bit of facts and statistics about drowsy driving, which will set the stage for my colleagues. First, nearly a decade ago, National Sleep Foundation convened an expert panel to determine how much sleep we need to drive safely. And what this panel came to the conclusion was that who have slept for less than 2 hours in the preceding 24 are universally unfit to drive. So I just want to repeat that. Less than 2 hours in the preceding 24, you should not be behind a wheel under no circumstance. And that most people, so the majority of us, would be impaired with only 3 to 5 hours of sleep. Again, less than 5, you probably should not be operating a motor vehicle. Now, there are several at-risk groups that I just want to highlight briefly. Young drivers, especially males under the age of 25, commercial long-haul drivers, shift workers, people with undiagnosed and untreated sleep disorders, as I already mentioned, business travelers, and parents, especially parents of younger children and parents of multiple kids, are all at higher risk, mostly because of the challenges to their sleep health, right? To the duration, to the satisfaction, to the consistency, and all those sorts of things. So if we go to the next slide, there are multiple pathways that one back that insufficient sleep make it unsafe to drive. So this is a little word collage of all the different things that can happen when you don't get enough quality sleep. Some of the things I want to call out are the reaction time, and then some of the mood things, the anger, the aggressiveness. You're more likely to get upset when someone cuts you off and make a bad decision. You're more likely to speed. You have these micro sleeps. A really, I think, compelling statistic is that at traveling at 55 miles an hour, so somewhere between like an interstate and a busy city road, right? Because busy city road is 45 miles an hour, interstate is 65. So somewhere in between there, you're either speeding or you're going too slow. If you closed your eyes for 5 seconds, you traveled 403 feet. So 1 1/3 football fields. What can happen in that distance? It's astronomical. And then you have less ability to maintain lanes, to hit your brakes, all these sorts of things. There is an abundance of studies that demonstrate that being awake for extended periods of times equals to, and in many cases surpasses, the negative consequences of the legal limit when it comes to alcohol. So actually, sleep deprivation and insufficient sleep can result in worse reaction times and worse decision making oftentimes than 0.05 BAC. We go to the next slide. I wanted to hit briefly on some drowsy driving myths. I think the first one is very important. You cannot will yourself to be awake, just like you cannot will yourself to stop breathing. As I said at the beginning, it's a biological imperative. The drive to sleep will take over. Caffeine is not a sleep substitute, it's a stimulant. It might help you get to your final destination, but don't think of it as a substitute for sleep. The idea that you'll know when you'll fall asleep and that you could pull over before then is again another myth. our ability to kind of self-reflect dwindles as we've lost sleep. So you're actually become a worse judge of your own behavior as you get more and more sleepy. Rolling down the windows, blasting loud music, again, not a substitute for sleep, and you can certainly fall asleep under those conditions. Young drivers actually need more sleep, 8 to 10 hours. And just because you've done it before does not mean that it'll be okay this time. Getting lucky in the past in no means and no way predicts someone's ability to be lucky this time around. What we do know is, if you go to the next slide, is that drowsy driving starts with sleep. It's in the name, it's drowsy. Yes, there's something about repetitive behaviors and medications and this and that, but we know that adults who get National Sleep Foundation's recommended amount of sleep are less likely to drive drowsy and do so less frequently. Next slide. There are a couple other prevention strategies that we like to suggest to people. First, be aware of the signs of drowsiness, those things that were listed earlier, and stop if you feel drowsy. You should not be driving with less than 5 hours of sleep based on the consensus work published, like I said, 9 years ago. Reschedule, pull over, assign a designated driver, use a rideshare or taxi, do anything you can to avoid driving while drowsy. Plan regular stops on long trips, every 100 miles, every 2 hours. Plan your long trips with a companion who, one, could drive, and two, can monitor you for signs of drowsiness. And importantly, we do really need to experience a cultural shift. We need to all feel empowered to say something or do something if you see or know someone who hasn't gotten enough sleep and is planning to get behind the wheel. Only when we take this on upon ourselves will we really start to, I think, have an impact on road safety. Next slide, and I believe I am handing it off now.
Next slide, please. Next slide. Great. Let me just begin. We're so appreciative that the Louisiana Highway Safety Commission would actually hold this webinar. Thanks for doing this. And I think Joe really encapsulated, there's so much information here, we can barely touch on it. And so our hope really is that what you've done is plant a seed, get everybody started, and then there's going to be a lot more work after this to not only learn more, but figure out how to apply this. So I'm going to really just talk about three things. One is I'm going to just provide a bit of a societal context to the issues that we're talking about. Second, I'm going to add a little bit of nuance to what the individual risks are that people don't typically think about. And then third, we're going to focus a bit on the workplace, corporate settings, organizations, where you work, and what are some of the things, because it's a little bit different than just thinking about the individual and what's going on there. So I just want to start with this because, it ends up what Joe just described, how we're biologically built with the need for sleep and a stable circadian clock doesn't actually coincide with how we live in our 24/7 society. And so we are constantly in challenging situations where our biology is challenged by what's going on in the world and the demands of our jobs, our family life, etc. The next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit. There we go. I'm just going to take 3 slides very quickly to talk about. I'm had the privilege of serving on the National Transportation Safety Board as a board member. And while I was there, we saw fatigue in all kinds of investigations. And I really consider NTSB one of the premier crash investigation organizations in transportation. And before I left, we did a study. And in fact, all the slides that you see here ended up having fatigue as an element in the investigation. And the study we did, though, in the next slide, actually looked at 12 years worth of investigations. And we went and actually looked, how often did you see fatigue as a finding, as the probable cause, as a contributing factor? So these are major NTSB investigations across all modes of transportation. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that when you're finding probable cause, 20% of those investigations had fatigue as an element. And so I always tell people, we keep seeing this, sleep loss, et cetera, about 20-21%. Every time you're looking at investigating an incident, you got to look for fatigue, sleep loss, circadian disruption, as at least 20% of the ones you look at are going to have some element to it. Okay. So I think as a society, we got to realize this is big for us. We diminish, we try and say, no, it's not really a big deal. We're all experts because we sleep, right? It's really a huge risk for people. The next slide. I wanted to bring this up because in the workplace, in operational settings, people mostly talk about fatigue. And that's kind of the catchword that people use. But I think what you heard from what Joe was just describing is it's really about sleep and circadian disruption that create this word that we use as fatigue. But the point that I wanted to make is that sleep and circadian disruption, that fatigue can literally degrade every capability we have as a human. And I always point out it can be degraded, where it just gets decreased in some way, or impaired, like there's no behavior coming out, there's no performance going on. So fatigue, everything. And people often ask, it's like, well, does that mean this or this or this? It's like every aspect of human capability can be degraded when you've lost sleep or that clock is disrupted in some way. So the next slide, I think this is important because it kind of takes us to a concept people don't think about. There's actually a continuum from when we're awake to when we're asleep. And the far right over here is asleep. I hope there's nobody on this webinar that would argue that if you're driving and fall asleep, that is a dangerous, major risk situation. There is no information coming in. There's no behavior going out. When you fall asleep, that is the ultimate danger, right, in a vehicle, okay? What most people don't realize is what I just described is way before you fall asleep, you can still be awake with your eyes open. And Joe talked about this as well, is your performance can be degraded. So that means 20%, 50%, 80% of those things that Joe was showing you, and I'm going to give you a list in the next slide in just a second. But what you will see is that a lot of these things are a critical part of your performance. So way before you actually fall asleep, you can have this reduced performance that puts you at risk. I'm going to give you an example of that in a second. But the other thing I just want to point out that's on the slide is it's not like your performance just keeps going down until you fall asleep. What happens is the performance gets reduced and it becomes variable. And so what that means is there are moments where you think like, I'm good, I'm okay, I can make it those last 10 miles home. And there are other moments where literally you could be having micro sleeps, which is sleep, no information coming in, no behavior going out, but literally in the next moment, you're awake again. And so before you fall asleep, performance gets reduced and it's highly variable. And the next slide, I think is important because a lot of people, Joe talked about these as well, but you can see all the kinds of performance that can be degraded, the things that are increased. But the point I put up here is people think, well, I lose a little sleep and I'm off my game by just a couple percent. What's the deal? But we can literally see performance being degraded by 20, 50, 70, 80%. And I'm not going to go over all of these. I'll just bring up one. Decision-making can go down by 50%. Well, does that mean I just stop making half my decisions? It's like, no, you still make them, but half of them are bad. And by the way, you don't get to choose which ones are bad. Should I pull over? Should I slow down? Should I give more space in front of me, etc.? Literally, that degraded, reduced performance can put you at risk way before you actually fall asleep. So the next slide, please. So I put this up. Joe gave one example. Here's another one. The average reaction time for somebody is about 250 milliseconds. So a brake light goes on, and if you look, the average reaction time to respond to that's about 250 milliseconds, okay? It ends up, okay, what happens if that reaction time is increased by just 10%, okay? So 20%. So standard 250 milliseconds, now you're 50 milliseconds slower reacting to that brake light. It literally will take you 5 feet longer to stop your vehicle. Think about it. So instead of being pissed off that somebody in front of you put their brakes on or did something goofy, instead you're in a crash. So literally 50 milliseconds, you're awake, you're still seeing what's going on, you're thinking about what to do, but that 50 milliseconds slower is enough to make 5 feet now what's needed for you to brake safely, okay? You're gonna see that increase. And this is just traveling at 70 miles per hour. So this is how that reduced performance translates into literally just being upset by a situation to being in a crash. The next slide, please. So I have 2 slides I'm gonna just talk about very quickly. The thing that everybody asked about is, so tell me how to fix this. Okay, I get it. This is dangerous. I don't wanna be in a car with bad things going on. And I always point out that in the workplace, people have a lot of different jobs. There are a lot of individual differences between those people, and the physiology is complex. Joe said their whole courses, you got a few slides. The next slide. But because of these challenges, we know there's not a simple or single solution to fixing all of this, even drowsy driving. There's no one size fits all. And in fact, the closest thing we get to a magic bullet is sleep. But even then, you've heard if that sleep is disrupted or you have a sleep disorder, even that may not be the magic bullet you think you have. So the next slide. So from an organizational standpoint, and this is what's great about providing these slides to people, because we're going to give you introductions, but there's more opportunity to look over these. This is what's often called a fatigue risk management program or a fatigue management program or a system. And these are all the different elements that an organization or corporation can actually put in place to deal with sleep and circadian disruption that can happen related to the workforce. And I'm not going to make a big deal about this now, but I will just say a lot of people think, well, I'm not in transportation, for example. This doesn't, no, this applies to everybody. And there have been cases where people, especially after a long work period, have a drowsy driving crash afterwards. And we have this in a lot of first responders, medical residents, et cetera, where we know this occurs. And very often those organizations that manage those schedules are the ones that are held liable and responsible for what goes on. So this is something everybody needs to keep in mind. And I'm just going to mention a couple of these. One is, I really believe education and training is the foundation for any kind of thing you want to do. So again, LHSC, good for you for doing this. You've planted the seed, you've got it started, you've started to put tools in people's hands to do something about it. Scheduling, another big one. I got 2 slides coming up, we'll do very quickly. It's important for people to know the strategies. Besides just good sleep before you go, what about caffeine? What about naps? How do you use those strategies? Already heard about sleep disorders. It's important policy support that. And Joe's already talked about culture change. I have a slide at the end for that. But let's talk about scheduling in the next slide. And I'm just going to have this one and one more. This one just talks about the kind of things Joe was talking about. What are the physiological things you got to worry about when you think about your schedules? Well, that's giving people enough time to actually get the sleep they need. So I always say this, if people only get 8 hours off sleep, how do you expect to go home, change your clothes, maybe have a bite to eat? You can't get 8 hours sleep, okay? How long you're awake is an issue. So I always point this out, even if you had great sleep, but we keep you awake for over 16 hours, that can also look like your performance is you've been drinking too much of alcohol, okay? The time of day gives you effects. And guess what? Bad news, when you've lost sleep, it builds into a sleep debt, which is just like your bank account, taking you into the red, okay? So if you don't get the sleep you need, over time that builds up. And if you don't get enough recovery time, so you work during the week, but you got that weekend recovery time, got a really good weekend. Well, if you've got a sleep debt, you're in the red, you may start the next week still in the red. Okay, so you got to have sufficient recovery. That's the physiology. But the next slide shows you what are the things in a schedule that an organization or corporation or a workplace does. These are all the things that determine that, right? Do you get enough off-duty time, et cetera? Do you get enough of that recovery time? This shift schedule. And I point this out because everyone thinks, oh, these are just for night workers. No, it's not. Anybody that's got, again, long days or not enough off-duty, they basically are at risk for having sleep and circadian disruption affect them when they're driving. The next slide. So I'm just going to point this out. I often think about preventive versus operational. And one of the things I think for the participants here to think about is, so what are the things you can do before you ever get on duty, before you're on the job, before you're on the shift, versus what are the operational strategies that are available to you once you're there? Okay, that's where caffeine, maybe naps, et cetera, play an important role. Next slide. So Joe brought this up because I think this is essential. If we don't change the attitudes, I'll sleep when I'm dead, that doesn't affect me, et cetera. But those attitudes have to be associated with changing behavior. So the next slide. And how we do that as far as safety culture goes, I just put this in here because people often say, okay, we need a great safety culture tomorrow. Doesn't happen like that. Literally, safety is not a destination. It's a cliche, but it's a journey. Takes a while to get there. You have to think about it proactively. How do we prevent things, not just react afterwards when bad stuff has happened? It's got to be about the attitude as well as the behavior or the actions that you take. And the last 2 things I just put on there because it's very popular right now in aviation, literally required by the FAA for certain things, but there are safety management systems that can help you with the safety culture where fatigue risk management plays a part of that. And I think the next thing, which we're not going to talk about here, but as administrator in NHTSA, I can tell you there's so much cool, exciting technology innovation that's going on right now that's going to help us address this as well. Last slide. I just put this up here. I think this was just published about 2 years ago, maybe. It's really the first handbook like this on fatigue management and transportation. And since you're going to give these slides to everybody, there's some great chapters in here on everything from how do you investigate fatigue, sleep loss, circadian disruption in an incident investigation. So I noticed there's some law enforcement people that are on the call that are enjoying the webinar, I hope. And so they can look to see how that's done. These are chapters by folks at the NTSB and the Canadian Transportation Safety Board, all the way up to, so what are the elements of a fatigue management program and how do you actually implement them, to the last chapter that looks at, so what's in the future. So again, there may not be a magic bullet. Sleep is the starting point, and there are a lot of things that organizations can do to help improve fatigue overall, but it's very specifically focused on making sure people get home safely, so they can both be with their families and back to work safely the next day.
Just for a quick time, thank you, Mark. Just for a quick time check, I think we've got about 10 minutes left. I can get through this pretty quickly if you want to have a bow on the end from LHSC. First, I wanted to
John,
thank...
please take your time.
Great. Okay. Well, I want to thank the state of Louisiana and also Ms. Lisa Freeman. We've been talking about this for a while, and I really want to applaud, from our perspective, applaud the state for making this type of program available, and I hope it serves as a model for other states and other departments. So spread the word to your colleagues across state lines. This is an important topic, and it really is going to take everyone doing their part across the country for us to make a difference. I either have the easiest presentation of the day or the toughest presentation of the day, depending on how you look at it. I think it could be the easiest because a lot of what I'm going to share with you, it just makes sense. And it builds on what Joe and Mark have already shared. But it can be the toughest because, you know, after we look at the statistics and we consider the numbers and see how compelling they are, this really does all boil down to people. And it boils down to families, family members, parents and kids and friends. And, you know, we were in Washington last week and we had Jennifer Pierce who shared a story about her sister, Nicole, that I really hope no one on this call ever has to share. And she was courageous for doing that. So if there's anyone on this call who knows that your work is getting directly to the drivers, the kids, the parents, workers, please include sleep, health, and safety content in any of your driver programming. We are a resource for you. TheNSF.org is where you can go, and certainly you can approach us directly or through LHSC. We're going to need all hands on deck as we're working to move the needle on this issue. So what can families and teams do to reduce drowsy driving? On the next slide, I'm going to just tee up, extend on what Joe had presented before. We believe that families are key. Drowsy driving is a family sleep health and safety issue. And that means that all family drivers need enough quality sleep to be alert and awake when they're behind the wheel. Now, we know teens have particularly challenging lives. They're almost a perfect storm when it comes, they're living through a perfect storm when it comes to their sleep health and safety. And they're influenced by their biology, as we all are, but they have a particular biology. And the behaviors that they choose to make and the environments that they're living in or learning in, they affect teen sleep. And so we are pushing because we believe families can prioritize sleep for health and for performance, which includes safer driving. On the next slide, please. So some basics. We know that teens have unique sleep needs, and you've seen this schematic earlier today. You might have seen it out in the public. It's something that's produced on the research that National Sleep Foundation has done for sleep duration standards and in guidelines. And in the red, these are teens. So we talk a lot about the 7 to 9 hours that most adults need. Teens are going to need between 8 and 10, maybe some of them even between 7 and 11 hours of sleep a night. So they have a greater sleep need. And they have a biological, we talked about a difference too. We talked about the circadian biology that helps to drive, I shouldn't say drive actually when we're talking about homeostasis, but the circadian biology that influences our sleep. And these teens have what in the field they call somewhat of a phase delay. They're going to stay, their biology is going to have them stay up later at night, and it's going to have them sleep longer in the morning. And that will happen in their teens until maybe they get around 20 years old. And that can mean a difference of, at least 2 hours between what younger kids are needing or what older folks are needing. So they have biology that changes what they need for sleep. And you can go to the next slide, please. So we start with sleep when we're looking at how to improve or prevent drowsy driving. Well, when you look at the state of teen sleep in America, and Joe shared some of this, this is NSF work. We know that 8 out of 10 kids or teens don't regularly get enough sleep. We know, back to what Joe had shared before, that a third of these kids, this is what they tell us, that they're not satisfied with their sleep to a grade of an F. And these are somewhat old data, but they're going to be consistent. Most of these kids at this age are getting fewer than 7 hours, less than 7 hours sleep. Now, remember, these are folks that on average, the data have showed that we need 8 to 10. Well, if you need 10 hours and maybe even 11 hours and you're only getting 7 or less, that's a pretty significant sleep deficit. And so these kids are chronically sleep deprived in our culture, in our country. So what contributes to this inadequate teen sleep? Certainly their social schedules. And we all know this. We all see this. We see how teens are these days and what they're wrestling with between school or work or their social schedules. They tell us that their job and schoolwork demands are getting in the way of them getting the sleep that they need. School start times, which is more of a policy issue, it's super localized. But we know that school start times that are earlier in the day have a negative effect on kids. Remember, these kids biologically are going to be sleeping later in the morning. So if they're up later at night and they need to be sleeping later in the morning, but they're up for a 6:30 or 7 o'clock bell time, they're going to be sleep deprived. And if they're driving, they're going to be at risk. Mental health, we know that this is a door that swings both ways. Kids have a lot of anxiety that are affecting their sleep. And we also know that the kids who are not getting enough of the quality sleep that they need or not satisfied with their sleep are also going to have higher prevalence of mental health symptoms for depression. And then the nighttime behaviors. Well, we know what the kids are doing at night. They're on their screens, they're consuming really activating content, they're socializing, they're procrastinating from going to sleep. So they're not just up late, but they're also doing things that are highly activating when they are up. Next slide, please. So again, we asked teens. We asked them to tell us about drowsy driving. This was just a couple years ago. And what we heard is that drowsy driving risk starts early. 1 in 6 teens have driven drowsy just within the first 2 years of driving. So they are new to the wheel and they are already, 1 in 6 teens have experienced drowsy driving when they're behind the wheel. Most teens, 95% of teens in this country say that drowsy driving is very risky, highly risky, but they rate drunk, drugged, and distracted forms of impairment as more dangerous than drowsy driving. That's something we have to change attitudinally. Okay. They also tell us that schoolwork and demands and jobs keep them from getting the sleep that they need to drive alert. And we've heard that teens with jobs are twice as likely to drive drowsy. So these are the things that the teens are telling us are getting in the way of their safe driving. Next slide, please. Now, there are policies that can help. Graduated licensing programs help keep kids safe. School start times, very challenging issue. We should just address that right up front. It's very, very local. It's a very challenging issue across the country, but it is tied to evidence that kids can stay safer. Later start times are better for kids. We recommend that. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that. Other sleep science organizations and kids organizations recommend that. It is a challenge executionally, but the science says that it helps. Next slide, please. So what can we learn about drowsy driving in families? And these are questions that we just asked the American public, and we want to share some results here with you. Next slide, please. So first, among families, when we ask parents, sleep is a top priority for family health and safety. In fact, parents rank getting enough sleep to drive alert as the most important thing to help keep their families healthy and safe. I'm going to just say that one more time because I'm not sure we expected to see this. Parents rank getting enough sleep to drive alert as the most important thing to keep their families healthy and safe, higher than diet, higher than exercise, higher than limiting TV. Next slide, please. So let's talk about adults. We know, and I think Joe might have shared some of the statistics around adults who are driving drowsy. Parents are at particular risk within families for drowsy driving. When we look at the number of kids that parents have, parents with multiple children have driven drowsy the most. Single child, still high. No child, still high. But you can see how this is, the more kids they have, there are really a lot of things happening in the family, and the chances are they've driven drowsy. More for more kids. Next slide, please. So parents with multiple children are most likely to drive drowsy at least every week, twice as likely as adults who are not parents. And again, the idea of having many things happening in the family, 1.5 times more likely than parents of single children. So you can start to understand how important the family dynamic is in managing this issue, both as adults and before as kids and teen drivers. Next slide, please. So how do families contribute to drowsy driving? Well, more than 1/3 of adults say that family obligations interfere with getting the sleep they need to drive, and more than 1 in 5 or 20% of teens say that family obligations are getting in the way of getting the sleep that we need to drive alert. So we need to reflect on the kinds of things that families can do to prioritize sleep and manage the variety of activities that are interfering with the sleep they need. Next slide, please. But also, families can help to prevent drowsy driving. And in our research, more than 70% of the adults have spoken up. They've spoken up and they've said, you shouldn't be driving if you don't have enough sleep. And when these pleas are made, I think this is an important insight. When pleas are made not to drive while drowsy, they're directed at family members. Family members are on the receiving end of this plea not to drive if you haven't had enough sleep to be alert behind the wheel. And still, less people ask about drowsiness compared to other forms of impairment. And so some earlier work that we did, and we looked at how people change their behavior. If someone has had a couple of drinks, they're much more likely to change their driving behavior than if they haven't had enough sleep. We need to change this culturally, right? Drowsy driving is impaired driving. Depending on how much sleep you're in deficit, it's like you've been drinking. Next slide, please. So coming from National Sleep Foundation, you would expect to hear that sleep is the answer. 7 to 9 for most adults, 8 to 10 for most teens. Drivers who get our recommended amount of sleep per night are less likely to drive drowsy. This is why we need to be talking about sleep health and anything that has to do with training and educating people about driving. Next slide, please. So it's like Joe said up front when he was talking about those simple steps or those 3 different things you can do during the day to help with sleep, 3 different things you can help at night. You can do at night to help with sleep. These are practices and principles that we can follow at the family level. Next slide, please. So other important strategies, in addition to those healthy sleep behaviors that should be discussed as a family, we need to be prioritizing sleep at the family level. We need to communicate openly about sleep needs and barriers amongst the family. We should be planning activities together to minimize negative impacts on sleep. Frankly, we have to hold each other accountable within the family, friends and family, for practicing healthy sleep behaviors, and create a household culture that values sleep as essential to safety. Now, I'll just add this as an aside, because I know most everyone on this call can probably relate to it. I'm a dad. I have a young driver. I've got a young guy that I'm worried about driving 7 hours to get back to campus or 4 hours to get to friends and family. And this is something that I think we all can relate to. And this is something we can talk to our young people about and make sure they understand the importance of getting enough quality sleep before they're behind the wheel. Again, if you are in the chain of helping to educate other people about this and train the trainers, this should be top of the list in what we're educating people about. Next slide, please. So quickly, it's in press, but we'll be publishing a position statement on drowsy driving that is, it's actually pretty detailed across different interest groups and things that different groups can be doing to help prevent drowsy driving. It's in press now. It's going to be published in our journal, Sleep Health. And on the next slide, really quickly, you can see that there are recommendations within this position statement for everyone, for public health and government, for employers, for automotive and tech industry, and for funding agencies. I won't go into the details. We can make this available to anyone here soon, even before it's published in the journal. But as we said earlier, this is an effort that we really need all hands on deck for. Next slide, please. Which is emphasized in this final beautiful graphic that Joe developed. It's going to take a village. It's going to take us all looking at the different ways that we can connect with the people who can educate and actually practice good sleep health and safe driving. So I think that's it from me. I don't know if we're going to have a Q&A, but again, I really want to thank the state of Louisiana and thank LHSC and Lisa Freeman and her team, and our host, for giving us the opportunity here to speak with you.
Thank y'all so much. We aren't going to have quite time for Q&A, but there are just a couple of points that I want to, put a bit of a bow on. I'm so grateful, Dr. Rosekind, that you talked about this document around organizational management. Here in the state of Louisiana, the petrochemical industry is so big, and that really requires, even the manufacturing of it, everything from, the drawing of it out of the ground to the manufacturing of it to transporting of it, which requires a lot of shift work, right? Because folks are then continuously working. And so that's whether they're offshore or onshore. And again, whether they're at all stages of that petrochemical extraction, refining and transport process. So that is a major, one of those 5 key focus groups are here and working every day in the state of Louisiana. So, one of the questions I was going to ask you to touch on was around resources for workplace, to improve workplace culture. So I really appreciate your reference to that document. So thank you. It was incredibly timely. John, I do want to give you a moment. Tell everyone, at a minimum, the URL for your website. Many of our stakeholders who are on the line do conduct a lot of community education with young drivers, and by extension, their families. So I want them to be able to find the data that you referenced on your website. Sure. So go ahead and do that for me real quick.
Let me do that. There's only one National Sleep Foundation. We are at theNSF.org. That is theNSF.org. Maybe we can put it in the chat too. There you will find good information for teen sleep and for drowsy driving. Good blog stuff.
I see Joe put it. Thank you so much, Joe, for putting that in the chat for us. And so folks, the website for the Sleep Foundation, the Sleep Foundation, is theNSF.org. And then The last item is, Joe, if I might ask you just a bit. So someone who is now becoming more familiar or starts to hear about this, notices their drowsy driving behavior, it has become chronic, or maybe a bystander, and they want to start a conversation with their medical professionals, their physicians, or how do you start that conversation, if you don't mind, just a bit?
That was a great question. And to me, it assumes that we're thinking that the underlying cause is something medical, right? Because if you see some chronic drowsy driving and you're someone who goes to bed at midnight and then wakes up at 4:30 in the morning for work, well, to me, that suggests a different maybe tactic. Try to carve out some more time for sleep, prioritize your sleep a little bit differently. But assuming that you're practicing healthy sleep behaviors, that you're allowing for sufficient sleep, and you're still finding yourself throughout the day being drowsy, fatigued, sleepy, having a hard time behind the wheel, this does call for the time where you should be speaking to your healthcare provider. And I think just being open and honest, letting them know, like, hey, I'm not feeling alert throughout the day. Behind the wheel, it's starting to scare me. When I'm at work, I have a hard time concentrating. It's going to impact every aspect of your life. And just having that open dialogue, expressing the importance that you see in sleep for yourself, and requesting an evaluation. It can be that simple. Like, I think it's time that I have a sleep study. Those are probably the words that you want to utter out loud. And your primary care physician should be able to set you up with a referral to an appropriately trained provider to get you into a specialist who can really do a good evaluation to hopefully pinpoint what might be happening, get you on the path towards an appropriate treatment.
Perfect. Thank
Can
you
I
much.
just a
Yes,
quick
please,
add,
Dr. Roskine. Mhm.
which is Joe covered all of it, but people should know that there are literally certified sleep centers and sleep medicine physicians. And so you can literally go online with the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, which are the clinicians, and look them up locally. Because your doc may know some of that, but you could actually help him or her find those resources for you.
Right.
Make sure you find
Be
a good
advocate for
certified
yourself.
individual and center.
Yeah, very true. I mean, depending on your own situation, you might not have to go through your primary care, or just go into your primary care with a little bit more information. That's exactly right, Mark.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, gentlemen. So, folks, again, this concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much for those who joined us and even hung on for a few extra minutes. It was definitely worth it. If you have your cell phone handy, please open your camera app, take a picture of the QR code here on the screen. It'll redirect you to a brief survey. It's just about 8 questions. It's Survey Monkey, so many of you are familiar with it. Fill it out, submit it. It's anonymous, but it will help us, improve our future training webinars. Dr. Joe Jarzewski, Dr. Mark Roskine, Mr. John Lopos, heavy hitters today with the National Sleep Foundation. Thank you all so very much. I do want to go ahead and close out. If LHSC, Louisiana Highway Safety Commission, can be of assistance, you see right there the name and email address of our executive director. National Sleep Foundation, again, we were fortunate to have the Chief Executive Officer, Mr. John Lopos, here on the line. So there's John's information. Reach out to us. I have no doubt that John, Joe, and Mark would be happy to provide any additional resources to you all, regardless of, what your needs are. And with that, we're going to sign off of today's webinar. So thank you all so very much for joining.
Thanks all. Thanks, Kelly.